Hey guys, can you tell us if our mics are working, please? Mic check, mic check.
Yep.
Pretty sure it is. Working.
Yay! Alright, I'm Tim, this is Ben. We're working on Camelot Unchained, and this is our weekly update. So, yeah, we're going to go do our top 10-ish, and then we'll do Q&A at the end if you want to get excited about what questions to ask. I work with the engineering, Ben does the design, some of it.
Some of it.
And
Tim does all of the engineering.
Yeah, all of it. No. I'm lucky when I get to do engineering anymore. So have some engineering questions, have some design questions. We can't field much in terms of the art side of things. You guys will have to do that when Tyler shows up on stream. So we will jump right into this. It's been a super exciting week. We've been doing lots of work on the new and improved siege scenario. It's coming together. It looks good. It's fun. There's explosions. Pretty much everything you want out of life. So number 1, rubble. This week, Colin finished synchronizing building destruction with rubble creation. This fixes visual artifacts where rubble would not appear at the right time relative to the building damage that spawned the rubble. So the TLDR on that is, those of you who have been in the old siege scenario, you'd see like when you knock one of the big towers over, sometimes the rubble would show up before it disappeared from the keep, or it would disappear from the keep and several seconds later you would get rubble. We're working on choreographing all of that so that it all happens as you would expect. The piece of rubble vanishes from the keep at the same time that it gets turned into rubble. Yeah. And all that, so you either don't have windows or you have neither, or you don't have windows or you have both. That got in today. We're doing lots of testing and all of that around it. I think as we speak, internally, we'll let you guys know as soon as it's ready. I don't know if there's any of these you want to take, so just...
I don't know.
I'll go with this one, and you shout if there's one that looks Benley to you.
Okay.
So number 2 is a mix of tech and art. Color and lighting. George has been spearheading further work on a color grading system for the game. This will allow us to further and simply put, do more art direction on the game, as well as use it for more visual variation between areas of the world. We're using the current siege scenario as a test bed. So there's just lots of color grading work going on to add more better lighting and colors to the scene.
Yeah. This one, I know what this one is.
Go!
So, work in progress, world map, UI. James Q is working on the world map UI. He's created art concepts for the maps and sidebar, as well as the icons and tools filters for the UI. So this is the press M for map view of the world, which is something that we are working on having some style for and getting in as a feature for the game, which currently doesn't exist at all. You can't even open the map right now. We've had a map previously, but it was kind of programmatically generated and not very stylized, so this is kind of a prettier version of it that we'll be working on.
So we're upgrading from programmer art to real art?
Yeah, kind of like. I mean, we'll still have to like programmatically generate the base map, but then there'll be like a paint over of that that's either done through art or maybe done through like a Photoshop filter style thing. We're working on it, so we'll see how that turns out.
Number 4 is mesh simplifier work. Lee has improved the mesh simplifier from the previous iteration, greatly reducing the amount of verts we were generating on the buildings, which is very important because the buildings get destroyed throughout the scenario. This is also about twice as fast now, so we made it faster, we made it reduce better so that it renders faster after it's generated, and all in all, it's good perf work for buildings in general. How about, do you know what number 5 is? Can you speak to that?
I don't. Let me try. Let's see. So, tech payload locals. I'm just going to read this. Caleb worked on payload locals this week. Payload locals are a place to add partial formula definitions inside a part of an ability. You can think of this as a workspace where designers can perform mathematical operations. The most important part of this workspace is that disparate definitions can all contribute to the same equation. The direct feature this supports for users is having armor penetration buffs applied correctly. This also supports ability parts responding to armor penetration occurring. So,
Woo.
I don't really know what that means. We have had to do some work on the kind of back-end functionality of the ability system as far as payloads are concerned. Having armor and armor penetration kind of got taken out for a while because we were doing some very difficult things in the ability system to get some new features in. And so getting armor to work again properly has had some new things had to happen in order to make that happen. So that's basically what this is talking about. Not a lot of this is actually exposed when it says designers can do that. I can't do it. It's all still in C#, I think. But we're working on some back-end ability-related features and making that more flexible so that we can bring you guys more abilities.
George hopped in the chat to say, make it so abilities can do some math based on the state of other things.
Yeah, so a lot of so what we call payloads is basically any sort of ability data that you would bundle up and run later, be it through a projectile hitting somebody or like a periodic, like a dot could do something every so many seconds, or like if you've got a song that has something ticking. All of those are implemented via payloads. And this sort of lets us bundle up some of the math that happens in our equations and split them out between payloads and the ability parts that you guys use to compose your skills. So it just sort of allows us to distribute math into places where it's important to have them when we need to spread them out amongst several different places and then compose them. Projectile prediction. Matt has landed his projectile prediction. Going forward, we shouldn't see as much correction happening when they fly through the air. And so
that will be good.
Yeah, before you would see like when you fired a projectile, it would like arc and sort of do this little S curve to get on the appropriate trajectory. And so Matt's been doing a lot of good work in tuning that so that the client appropriately has the data it needs to predict the initial projectile, so that when the server actually tells you about the projectile, it doesn't have to course correct. So it'll make pretty much any projectile in the game look much smoother and more accurate and less wibbly wobbly.
Always a good thing.
You can talk about that one.
Yeah, I think I'll talk about this one. So number 7, work in progress gameplay support classes. After discussing the technical and engineering design needs of the support classes, Anthony has begun work to support their unique abilities. So these are the bard classes or speed classes, or however you want to phrase that. These guys mostly rely on aura based abilities, and that's sort of a new thing that we're trying to make sure that is performant, because if you run into a big group of enemies and you have an aura that affects them all, that has to scale and work without causing performance problems with a lot more players than any other game has to deal with. So this is sort of a unique technical challenge specifically to our game. That's something that we're working on. So that's our next set of classes that'll be worked on after mages. We're still doing some work on mages, obviously, but those are the components, the parts that mages are going to use are mostly done and working. There's some still technical things that need to happen to get all of those fully functional, but at the same time, we're just working ahead to the next set of things, and mostly the things that are going on with mages and stuff are still on art and getting all those audiovisual things put in for them.
And for the people who haven't followed our game, we make a distinction between healers and support classes. The healers are the guys that make your health bars go up. The support classes are guys who bring a myriad of support skills that aren't necessarily making your health bar go up.
So your healer is like your cleric, and your support is like your bard. So that's sort of what the difference is.
But my D&D bard does make health bars go up.
Well, they do. They can do a bit of. That's the thing about support classes. They kind of do a bunch of different things. So they have a little bit of this and that, but mostly they're focused on utilitarian things rather than just straight up healing.
Number 8, the ability builder. Christina set up the ability builder backend and passed it to AJ so he can focus on hooking the ability builder UI up to her API. Once everything is glued together, we'll be able to get this into testers' hands for the first pass feedback. So those of you that have been in any of our tests in the last month or two, I think is how long we've had the ability stuff in there, or the ability builder back turned on. You know, you've been using the dev UI. It's again, that's programmer art. It's developer interfaces created to support systems until we can get the real deal in there. So Christina and AJ have been working on the real deal, and we're gluing them together now so that we can get it into the game, get it into your hands, and you can start playing with the real UI as opposed to the programmer art.
There's number 9?
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a C that's on the second page. So.
Oh, there. Okay.
I'll hit this one.
Oh, you will? Okay.
Or you can do it.
Okay.
I don't care.
I can, because I know what all this stuff is. So this is work in progress VFX. Mike has been working on VFX for several things. This is of 3 parts. Part A is chaos effects for Druid. So Dart, Ball, and Impact have been added, and there are several people exclaim how much fun they like these. Okay.
They're super cool.
Yeah, so it's cool chaos explosions.
Everybody go play Doodads.
Yeah. B, secondary siege VFX, so smoking wreckage for the scenario that we're putting together, and just to make the battlefield feel more interesting. This doesn't actually give you, like, destruction of the trebuchet that you're using. Those still don't have, like, death animations and everything yet, but we added some just decorative broken trebuchets to the battlefield, and eventually that'll turn into being able to actually destroy them.
I like how the burnt out husks of trebuchets make the battlefield feel more alive.
Dead things make things feel more alive, obviously. And then part C of this is some tagging changes to fix VFX attachment. So there's a system of tags that allows us to map what visual effects play to what abilities based on components, because we're not actually making a full pre-made ability that you could just directly associate what visual effects play. If you have, fire plus ball, what effects do you play for that depends on the tags of those 2 things as a combined lookup into the visual effects. So sometimes there are bugs with that as things get very, very complicated in the various abilities that you can build, and Mike has been fixing some of those to make sure everything attaches to the right place and plays the right effects.
So that's
part C of number 9.
Yeah, and it sort of roll it. Well, I'll hit it. 10, which is trebuchets. Mike D has fixed a spectacular trebuchet animation glitch where bones were flying off every time it fired. This is a more general fix that allows animations to have more data in order to have longer clips and more interesting clips, especially on larger assets like siege engines. So anybody who hopped on a hatchery while we were having that, there was like the slings on the trebuchets were like flying off into space and doing crazy things, and basically all that came down to was there was more data in the animation than we had originally expected and allowed room for. And so Mike did a really great job of tracking it down and finding this where we were just doing bad things in memory because we didn't leave enough room for the animation. And so we gave ourselves enough headroom and also sort of future-proofed it a little bit. So it looked really cool. It was a really great find. It's fixed now, and yeah. So the next thing is number 11, tech collision-based sounds. Logan is making progress on collision-based sounds. Specifically, this is playing different sounds when collisions happen based on the material involved in the collision. So that you can have, like, if your projectile hits wood or stone or metal, it'll make different sound effects. Once this work is completed, we'll be able to add better sound effects to things such as projectile impacts or any other object-on-object impact. I expect it could also be used for like footsteps and stuff like that.
Yeah, I was wondering about footsteps.
But I haven't specifically seen it called out, so that may be an incorrect assumption on my part, but I suspect that's also what that would be used for.
Yeah.
I'll let you tackle 12.
Okay, so work in progress tech gear slot simplification. So Christina created a simple tool to help duplicate/combine existing equipment cogs. Cog is just a data object in our game that we've called cogs because we needed words. She used this plus a bit of manual fiddling in order to set up new equipment cogs as needed to support the simplified gear slots. So that's taking the previous allocation of gear slots for armor for your character and combining them into a smaller set of actual equipable items, and then that will later be broken back up into sub-items that you can craft when creating those items. So if you're going to make say, an arm piece, it will just be equipping one arm piece, but you'll still have to make like a shoulder and a vambrace in the crafting system, and then combine those into one item to actually equip.
Have we covered in the past why we're doing gear slot simplification?
I don't know if we've covered it on here. It's mostly just to streamline the number of things that you actually have to manage and maintain, because all of your armor has durability and takes damage, and will have to be equipped and repaired on your character. And it also gives us a bit more flexibility in the crafting system, because your crafter can decide which pieces to put together and to make a unique item. That's mainly what that was regarding, and it has a little bit to do with the previous system. If we want to go way back into how we were previously allocating health to different body parts, and since we didn't necessarily want to stick with that model, it allowed us to do some simplification, because most of the reason to have body parts have the armor slots broken up the way they previously were was to support body parts the way the health previously was, and so that since the health doesn't work that way anymore, the armor doesn't need to work that way anymore in order to support it, so it just allowed us to do some simplification there.
So it was fallout from that to just sort of make the players' lives easier, so they don't have to really micromanage stuff where there wasn't a lot of advantage to it.
Yeah, like it didn't need to be there anymore.
Right.
So it's just a streamlining of that process, because it's easier to have to equip fewer items to your character,
Right.
But it still allows us to craft all those pieces and have all that flexibility in the item creation system. It's just that you don't have to like worry about equipping them and repairing them and having all of these different items all on your character.
Groovy. Environment art, siege scenario. Number 13, Tyler, Dion, and John have been continuing work on changes to the new siege scenario. We've dramatically shifted the color around to facilitate the color grading and lighting changes that we talked about earlier. Continuing work on this zone has allowed us to also figure out issues needing to be addressed in lighting and texture generation. So Dion and John and Tyler have just been plugging away at the new zone. It's been getting more decorated, but at the same time they've also not just been adding stuff to it, been changing some of the color scheme to support all the lighting and color grading changes, and it's really starting to come together and look really good. I guess I'll hit LODs and you can have shields.
Yeah, do you want to explain LODs to people?
Dion removed more triangles from several models, which Joe Waded and Scott imported. We're trying to thread the needle between performance and visual quality to support a solid frame rate during large battles. We've talked about LODs in the past, but the quick and dirty of that is if you have a model, a character model, that looks really, really good when it's up close next to you, as that character moves far away, you don't need as much data. You don't need as large of a texture. You don't need as many triangles in the polys, in the model, in the mesh, and all of that. And having all of that data affects both performance and memory. And so we have different LODs, levels of detail. And the further away the character gets from you, or the more characters that are on screen, we use simpler and simpler models and textures to save perf. And also allow us to put more things on screen. But it's always a tuning match of like how many polys can we get at the different ranges such that it looks good, and we can basically hide the fact that we're using fewer polys because it's far away and you wouldn't notice the increased number of polys anyways. So that's what that's talking about threading the needle, is making it so that it's indistinguishable when it's further away but more performant.
Yeah, we basically want you not to be able to notice, right? We want to take away the polygons when you can't even see them anyway, but it's kind of tricky, and it's definitely, the less stuff we have to display, the better, so we try to cut it as close as we can. And so number 15, art shields. John, who is like literally doing this like right now, is
so there's
finishing
a great big shield right there.
because there's a shield on his screen. Is finishing updating all our previously made shields so they can be assembled in parts by crafters. This entails breaking them up into 3 parts in their UV, similar to how we assemble characters, which is similar to how we assemble weapons and everything else.
So what's the 3 parts of the shield?
I think it's like, there's like a detail piece that goes on the front, like an emblem sort of a thing. There's the actual face of the shield, and then there's like the strapping and the grip on the back of it. So I think those are the 3 shield parts.
So our goal eventually is, instead of crafting let's use a sword, that's a better example, but the shield's going to use the same system. Like instead of crafting a sword from metal bars, you would craft the hilt and the cross guard and the blade, and then you would combine those 3 pieces together, and so you could sort of mix and match the cross guard and the hilt and the blade that fit your particular character, your particular play style. we're applying that same philosophy and technology to the shields, so that you can combine the bits to get the look and or gameplay mechanics that are best for your character and your build.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our top 15, our top 10ish. So we've got some time for Q&A. Again, I work with the engineering team. Ben does the design sorts of things. So if you've got engineering or design questions, lay them on us. Or do we need to do a video before we go into QA? I forget the flow of all this.
No, we're just going to do it.
Do it!
All right.
Give us your questions. We used to have a video, but it confused people.
They were just intimidated by Scott's sweet whispers.
Oh, man. Okay. Giraffe has a beastie question. From a design standpoint, where do you see classes falling in terms of independence? Do you see classes falling into specific roles, performing those and only those roles well, and essentially skill capping classes and their usefulness in a rock, paper, scissor world, or are you shooting for a more versatile design path that will allow each class to perform well regardless of situation, depending on player skill? Is where it stops.
So it's more rigid, I think, than flexible. We're not trying to go with a route of anyone can do anything. A lot of games have gone in a more open-ended route where they have a few classes, but each of those classes has various different specializations and different directions they can go. In our case, we're going with a lot more classes. There's 30 classes plus crafters, and those classes have each a more narrowly defined role. There are sort of different routes that you can go. Obviously, you can pick and choose your abilities and by crafting them yourself out of ability components that you unlock based on your own preferences. So there's going to be differences in how each character ends up playing, but they all have sort of a specific role that they do. Like earlier, we were talking about healers and crafters, right? So healers are not so flexible that you can have like a DPS spec healer. That's just not a thing. Healers are healers, pretty dedicated, but you can have more of a focus towards sustain versus burst healing. You can have some utilitarian and protective defensive things, so you can try to either be more mobile and just stay away from trouble, or you could be more heavily armored and just survive through things attacking you, having higher stability so you don't get disrupted as easily, things like that. So there is some flexibility there in doing the thing that you're doing, but your overall goal, your purpose is fairly well defined for each class. There are some that are less well defined, so there are some hybrid classes like Devout have a damage and a healing role, but they're dedicated to that, so their thing is doing both of those things. So everybody sort of does have their specific thing. It's not quite as flexible as some other games you've seen out there, but there are a lot of different classes. So if there's something you want to do, there's probably a class that you can pick up that will go along that role.
And so back when we started working on this project, we laid out a bunch of our foundational pillars, our FPs, and one of our big ones is that choices matter. And so if you pick a melee tank style class, the goal is that picking that class has relevance throughout the life of that character. And so if we had enabled you to do anything and everything, it would sort of water down that choice that was made, one of the first most important choices that you made of which class is this character going to be. That being said, there are some other choices, like I really like some of the choices with the Wave Weaver class that I've been playing a bunch of recently. Like he's got a boon that you can pick up that adds some healing to some of your abilities, but the opportunity cost of getting that boon versus say another one that does damage means the difference between I'm a little bit more self-sufficient, I've got a little bit of healing, but I'm sacrificing damage for that. Or as Ben said with the healers, there's a couple of primary play styles that we've seen come out of those so far, which is going the lighter, more nimble armor and pre-kiting and avoiding damage versus just trudging into the thick of things with heavy armor and hoping that you can support your team while getting wailed on. And so our goals, our foundational principles is that the choices you make are important. They matter and they affect the development of your character.
Mort Grease on the YouTube chat asks, in Arma 3 map you can see the height of the terrain. Can you do the same in CU?
So the map that we're looking at making right now is sort of a stylized map. So if you look at like medieval maps, if you like Google search, you'll see how those are sort of hand drawn and how they don't necessarily give like exact height information. Like if you go to Google Maps or something and you just do topographical map, like this is not medieval technology. This is like satellite imagery. So like we're not giving you that degree of fidelity, but we will give you things like, you know, there are mountains over here, there's a forest over here, and a reasonable view of what the world looks like, so you can kind of navigate and tell where things are. But we want to abstract it a little bit and make it stylized in a way that makes sense for a fantasy-based game.
Lotaween asks a question that's right at the intersection of art and design. Will there be VFX that will be distinguishable from range when a character is affected by a movement-reducing effect, such as frost or vines?
Yeah, so that should already be the case. Like if you're hit by a frost arrow, there's a big puff of white stuff that goes off that you can see that you were affected by that. There's the vines, I think there's a green wrappy around leafy thing that happens to you. So yeah, you can tell that those are effects, but you should be able to tell when just about anything happens. So, you know, if a fireball hits you, you can tell that there's fire particles going off of someone and that they're affected by a fire ability, which will be important later for things that interact with fire and will either get rid of it or cause it to have some other weird interaction with magic. But yeah, the idea of our visual effects system is that it's supposed to inform you of what's happening to people. And of course there's another layer of the icons that show up in the unit frames. So if you click on that person, there's a list of the effects that are on them, and you can mouse over those to get the text, so you can say, oh, well, what is that? Why is that guy green over there? Well, he has this icon, and the icon shows the tooltip, and the tooltip text explains, and hopefully that'll be a reasonable amount of information. And once you have a good feel for the game and you've played it for a while, you'll generally know just by looking at characters what's going on with them and not have to necessarily rely on those other ways.
But like with the LOD, there's a bit of a balancing act here of, if there's a guy standing out in a field and he's got a frost debuff on him, you want to be able to look at him and say, oh, that guy's got a frost debuff on him. But when there's 1,000 guys out in a field, it sort of they can muddy the waters, so to speak, and so there's this very fine balance of us having precise and legible VFX to communicate these things that don't necessarily bleed into the other characters' spaces, and hopefully are discernible in both a sparse field and in a big Zerg battle.
Yeah, we have to be a little bit more subtle with our effects, like Tim was saying, because we have so many characters and because we have a lot of effects going on from those characters onto targets. So you won't necessarily see big, giant, flashy effects like you see in some other games, especially Korean games that really like to hype up the particles, which is cool stylistically, but it doesn't really work for us just because we have so much stuff going on in large battles. So we're trying to make sure that things are readable, but as subtle as we can get away with, so that there's not too much visual clutter going on and you're still able to read what's happening.
Daladin asks, will you also design sword and shield attacks that do not involve throwing your shield to the side, exposing yourself to the enemy?
So a lot of that comes down to just the animation. It's not the design of the ability. It's just the stylization of the animators when they try to make something that will actually read and look cool. You'll see a lot of the animations in the game look more like what you'll see in movies than look like what you'll see in like Arma or HEMA or whatever you want to call the medieval fighting organizations, because it's not meant to be practical. It's meant to be readable and it's meant to look cool. And people will disagree on what that means. If it's like, oh, that's just unrealistic, there's no way he would open himself up that much, because he would reasonably be killed if he was really doing a sword fight. But that's something, we're always looking for feedback on that. So if you're like, I don't like this animation or whatever because of such and such reasons, or this looks cooler than that, or here's this other game that has this other cool thing, feel free to post that stuff on our forums and let us know. That's always something that we're looking to improve and iterate on, is how we're animating our characters and what we can do with that. But yeah, largely we're not necessarily trying to make a sword fighting simulator or a real life simulator or something that looks incredibly realistic, although I tend to like things that are a lot more realistic than a lot of our animators do. I do agree that it does need to read better, and it does need to be more flashy than something that would be literally realistic, because that way you can see it, you can read it better in the game from distance and from different perspectives, and it feels a lot more like a video game when there's all these crazy spells and jump attacks and crazy things going on that you wouldn't see in real life. It needs to sort of fit in that world. So there's more stylization than literal realism that's being applied there.
But from the game design side, we can do stuff like if you're holding an axe and a shield, you could put in a component on your axe attack that reflects the fact that you could be more defensive because you have a shield, right?
So that kind of comes down to the animations. Earlier in the design, one of the things that I really wanted to be able to do was have like a different anim set for like defensive and offensive stance.
Right.
So if you're in defensive stance, just the way that your character stands and all of the animation they perform from that stance are a certain way that looks more defensive. And if you're in offensive stance, then you're more open and your character moves more and looks more animated and more ferocious.
I'm not talking visually, but just about the game design, right? You could conceivably like make an ability that says, if I'm attacking with an axe and I have a shield equipped, like give me a damage resistance of 5% for 5 seconds.
Yeah, no, gameplay wise, it definitely works.
Yeah.
And those stances and things exist, and you can switch between dealing more damage and taking less damage as different stances and gameplay wise. But as far as the animations are concerned, whether or not you'll visually be able to see that that's different, because we make entirely new animations for each of those cases, and all of your animations are different from one case to another, is really up to time. Right now we don't have all of that set up, but we have a lot of animations to make and a lot of classes to make. And so we'll see how much time we have and how difficult some of those things are. I think there's still some animation tech that needs to go in that allows us to sort of blend what's going on with each arm and stuff. And so maybe that'll allow us to do a little bit better job of that, being able to visually read which of those stances that you're in, rather than just like looking at the icons of which stance, which effect is on the character to see which stance people are in. I think that would be really cool, but it really does come down to time and being able to make that quantity of animations times all the characters that are in the game.
JB is in the chat, so maybe he'll chime in on this. But Sivius asks, when crafting, the UI covers the whole screen currently. It kind of tears you away from the game world. Thoughts on reducing the size or having an adjustable alpha channel? Is it full screen for the option of crafting offline down the road?
So yeah, there's some JB question in there. I think the design of our UI for a lot of the full screen things is to take you out of the game, because we don't want you doing things like digging into your inventory and swapping out your armor and stuff while you're fighting, and then things like looking at the map or doing crafting or things like that are not things that you need to be doing while action is going on all around you. Some of the things are, I think, scalable for doing the UI outside of the game. Like some things are going to be accessible from the website, I think, like your character page. But those are questions for JB, I think, if that's exactly the same or if there's going to be a different version of that.
And as a crafter, right, like most of your experience is interacting with this box, so we sort of wanted to make it large and interesting and interactive.
Yeah, so being able to have your full inventory up, the screen is sort of split in half. This is kind of getting into the specifics of how the game works. If you guys are just looking at this on Twitch and don't have the game in front of you, I can't really walk through this with you very well. But the game is sort of UI panes are sort of split in half, so half the screen is one thing and half the screen is another thing. So you can have your inventory on one side and then your crafting system on the other side. So you have like basically access to a huge amount of inventory space, so you can be swapping things in and out while you're doing crafting. And if you minimize that down, it would be a little bit less convenient. It's something you can certainly do with UI mods, and our UI is very customizable. So if there's something that you really want to be able to do, like really be able to have like a minimal crafting UI or something, and you have an idea for how to compress it and make it so that it's super, super small, that's something you could potentially do as a UI mod. But the default idea of that is that, you know, when you go in and you start doing your crafting, you're interacting with this table. You have all the stuff that you need to be able to pay attention to and do in the crafting side of things. So having that screen space is kind of important, and it does put you into sort of a fully immersive experience where you're not paying attention to all the things that are going around you, and you're just involved in what's going on in the actual UI and the actual part of the game that you're interacting with.
Larry Flynn 7 asks, it's an MMO, so sometimes we need to take it as a comparison. Will there be only the standard general professions, which are mostly directed to stats, or also professions with actual game mechanics like engineering and WoW?
So professions. There's not really an analogy to that. So the way that WoW works, right, is that you have a variety of these trade skills, right? So you can pick up mining, you can pick up engineering, you can pick up like armor smithing, whatever, as any character in the game. In our game, crafting is a class. So it's not like if you're playing a Black Knight, you can decide to do mining or whatever. If you want to do mining, you pick a crafter. If you want to do swords making, you pick a crafter. If you want to do any making or any gathering of any type, you pick a crafter. So that's sort of how the breakdown works in our game. Instead of being like a sort of extra option that you have with any character that you play, it's a specific character. So if you want to do any kind of crafting, there's a whole class that's not limited exclusively to doing that, because you can go out and, you know, set traps and use siege engines and do repairs and all kinds of other things too. But you're not going to be great at like 1v1 combat. So that's sort of the trade-off that you make of crafting being a whole class as opposed to just a side talent or side profession that you can pick up as any class.
And inversely, the combatants can do a small amount of like,
yeah, so it's sort of the same thing,
like
right? So
your archer could make some rudimentary arrows if you're out in the field and you run out of arrows. You know, you could knock over a tree and make a couple of arrows to get you back to town or whatever.
Yeah, so we've sort of talked about that a little bit here and there of having something that Mark likes to call like popcorn crafting, right? Where it's like archers can just scavenge and make arrows so that if they run out of arrows, they don't have to like necessarily run all the way back to town to get more. But for things like, you know, making armor and stuff and anything that takes a long time, or if you're making 1,000 arrows or something, then you're probably going to want to have an actual crafter do that.
Glowing Worm asks, how much class prototyping time are you getting?
Jeez, well, it's hard to define that really, because right now we're using programmers to implement our initial set of ability components. So I'm not actually like sitting at my desk and doing prototyping like I would normally like to do, because the tools aren't there to be able to do that right now. So basically what I'm doing is I'm setting out lists of ability components and traits like banes and boons and stuff like that, all the class mechanics, all the class ability things, and handing them off to programmers, and then those get implemented. And I can do a little bit of you know, either going into C# files or going into some of the spreadsheets and the CSV files that are generating some of the data for that, and do some adjustments here and there. But there's not a lot of like mechanical prototyping in the way that you would normally be able to do if you had like a full set of tools that allowed you to actually fully create abilities as a designer. So I'm not getting a lot of time to do that, but I have a lot of time like directly interfacing with a programmer. Like there's a programmer now who is like literally sitting right next to me who's doing all of this implementation. So I talk to him like on a daily basis, and we work back and forth on getting things implemented and tested. So it's a bit of an odd workflow right now as we kind of wait on getting some more of the tools built up on top of the changes to the ability system that we've recently made. But it's just a bit different. So hopefully that will resolve, and we'll get a bit more direct access so that we'll have a better designer-facing scripting system to actually make abilities fully without programmer intervention. But for right now, it's just a lot of collaborative back and forth, and that allows us to get a bunch of stuff in while not having all of the tools that we necessarily would like to have.
Also does allow you to multitask a little bit better, right? Like you can sort of delegate the implementation of the ability details and go off and work on something else.
Yeah, so like right now
because we've only got one bin.
Yeah, so like right now what I'm doing is a lot of documentation and writing stuff on other things. Like we're going into some of the other crafting things, so like how crafting nodes are going to spawn and what's, you know, how does dyeing things work and things like that. So I'm kind of working on some of the other things while I'm waiting on the implementation side for like the support classes like we were talking about earlier. But you know, we're having meetings about that too, and talking about, you know, how does this work and how should this work, and I have a problem where, you know, if I take these two parts and I try to put them together and then I try to make another ability and I use one of the same parts, those two things overlap. As one of them stops and one of them starts, what happens as you're playing different songs? So that's just back and forth things that we're doing sort of at the same time. But yeah, it does let me do theoretically other things while I'm waiting for those implementation things to happen, but it doesn't allow me to just do them myself. Yeah. So it's sort of a trade-off, and it allows us to get things done still. It's just a bit of an odd workflow from what we would normally have.
Strike asks, What set of siege weapons do you envision the players will have in the final game, including potential expansions? Namely, ladders, siege towers, hooks with ropes, etc. Also, where are they supposed to stand in terms of range and damage? For example, will mortars have more range than trebs, but with less damage?
Okay, well, that's a pretty big question.
I feel like that's sort of a
Please
siege,
tell us all of the siege
a
things.
siege write-up.
Yeah,
Maybe we can do an article sometime.
maybe we can. We need to get a little bit further, I think, into our siege discussion. I think there was supposed to be a meeting like yesterday about that, and I think there was supposed to be a meeting maybe today about it, and in terms of like the technical implementation. There's a lot of stuff we want to do with siege engines is the problem, right? So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a problem either. That's probably the wrong way to phrase it, but the current state of siege is that we've put in some basics, some sort of default things that are just doing basic abilities, right? So you have like a scorpion and a trebuchet and the magic mortar that you were talking about, right? And they have different stats, right? I think the trebuchet has the longest range, and the magic mortar has similar damage but less range, and the scorpion is sort of somewhere in between, but it has different abilities. So it has like larger explosions or whatever with its like
Shrapnel.
Yeah, it has shrapnel, so it kind of explodes out over an area, and it hurts players more than it hurts buildings. So they're sort of different in their stats, and those can be adjusted over time too. Like the scorpion has like a wider angle, right? You can turn it further, but the trebuchet has to kind of shoot straight. So there's a bunch of things like that that are all getting adjusted, and that haven't gotten very far in terms of the actual iteration yet. But there are a lot of additional things that we want to do. We want to be able to have, for example, like multi-crewed siege engines where you can have multiple people all working on the same thing. We want to have
one guy winding and cranking, and turning, and one guy.
And we want to have siege engines that are mobile, right, where you can actually push the ram up to the door. We've talked about having siege towers. We've talked about being able to climb walls and things as one of the things we really want to be able to have, whether that's using ladders or using like climbing hooks or just straight up climbing walls. That's something we would like to be able to do. There's not been any technical implementation on that, but that's sort of why we need to have meetings and get technical people involved, because we're working on siege a lot right now. Like as we're talking about, there's rubble, there's buildings, there's meshes, there's all these things coming together for siege, including putting like magic mortars into the game, getting new siege effects and trebuchets to fall apart properly and all that. A lot of siege stuff is going on. So going the next step and saying, okay, we want to have some pretty crazy things going on with siege. There's stuff I haven't even said that we want to go into making some really interesting and unique fantasy siege things happen. But we need to know if it's technically viable. We need to do some investigation, have some conversations, and try out some stuff and see how well our system supports some of these things. So once we get a little bit further along in that process, then we can start talking about it a little bit more. But I don't think we're really ready to say quite some of these things yet, because we don't want to say, hey, we're going to do all these cool things, and then we get into technical discussions, and then we say, nope, actually we're not doing all of those things, but we're going to come up with these other different things. So when we have a more firm idea of what all the capabilities are and where the direction is going to go based on what's technically possible, then we'll talk about it, I think, a little bit more in depth.
Towards Gaming asks, if you see that your more rigid class system is badly received by players, would you make changes to make it less rigid, or will you stick to your guns and keep it?
That's kind of a hard thing to change, right? Because once you've got all these definitions, like right now it's still fairly early, right? So as we're doing early testing, we want to get feedback on this as soon as possible. So if we want to make any big directional changes, we're making them sooner rather than later. Obviously not too soon, because we don't even have all of our components in for some of these classes. So they're a bit more narrow now than they're intended to be, because they don't have all of their stuff yet. But once they do, and once we're a little bit further along into having some of our first classes have a full complement of things, it'll be a good time to actually do some of that evaluation. Early on, it's certainly possible that we can look at doing more diversification, if that's really something that a lot of people bring feedback for and say, like, this is not working for us. We need to be able to have more stuff to do as a specific class, because these definitions are just too rigid. And if you feel that you're not good at as a character, like in more than one situation where every class seems so situational, I think that would be a thing that we would want to address. If you don't feel that you can actually go out and generally participate because you're only useful like sometimes, that would be something we would want to take a serious look at. But as we get further and further along and our classes get further developed, it'll become harder and harder to make big sweeping changes like that to the fundamental architecture of what it means to be a class, right? So earlier on, it'll be some iteration and some investigation into finding what a class really needs to be good in a game like this, because this is a different game than probably any of the other games that you've played when we start talking about having massive scale battles, player run sieges, player constructed buildings, and how everything works in the context of our game. But once we've done some of the initial investigation on that and we're pretty happy with it for at least some of our classes, we can be fairly confident that adding more classes that fit sort of the same template of having a certain set of skills, a certain amount of diversity, let's say, that will work out fairly well as we add more things going along. So I think that's something that we'll want to, if we're going to make a big change, we want to make it sooner rather than later. But once we're happy with it in at least a few cases, we can just continue with it on to the future and be relatively confident that won't be a problem moving forward.
Yeah, we've been pretty open to feedback. I mean, we recently changed the way we were doing the health after, we made sure we put it out there, got lots of testing on it. It was there for a year or two.
Yeah, and we tried
lots of different things.
Lots of different things, different ways of displaying it in the UI, different ways for abilities to affect it, whether it was just specifically targeting specific health bars or abilities that were like sort of implicit, where it's like anything that like dazes you, like disorients you, affects your head just sort of implicitly.
Right.
So we did a bunch of things with that, and nothing really worked out. So we ended up taking it out, and that was just something that we decided we really needed to do, and so far it's working out pretty well.
And really, really early on in the project, we actually asked a very similar question to this one to our backers. We said, do you want your classes to have, say, multiple paths that they could go down to give them sort of broad strokes, or would you rather have a couple extra classes with fewer paths, more well-defined roles for those classes? And our players overwhelmingly said, we would rather have a larger number of more focused classes than a smaller number of more broad classes. And so we actioned on that very early and got your feedback about that very early.
Where to Grease asks, can the projectiles of the siege machines, like the trebuchet, bounce less or more depending on the surface they are hitting?
Well, right now I think they explode no matter what they hit. We've talked about being able to have things that actually bounce like along the ground and things like that, but that is a thing we would need to directly support through physics.
Yeah, we're running a full physics engine, so technically we are able to do that on both the client and the server. Some of that gets a little bit tricky when you try to start networking it. And so, as Ben was saying earlier, some of the design gets constrained by just the technical limitations. And I'm not explicitly saying that networking is a limitation here, but it's one of the things that we have to consider of, even if the server could allow your projectiles to bounce around and do cool things, and even if your client could allow things to bounce around and do cool things, sometimes getting them to do it in sync in a way that is interactive and understandable by the player is not always realistic.
Yeah. Keep in mind, I've asked Rob for things like water simulation for lava, like running down hills. So there's things that would be cool to do, but
and we had a bug a couple years ago where like your projectiles wouldn't go away after they collided, right. And players are running around like playing soccer with like grenades, basically.
Yeah.
And so we got some ideas from that, and that's something we would like to entertain. Just depends on if we have the time and the technicals to do it.
Yeah.
Strike asks, will we have a web-based version of the Ability Builder or Web API so players can build it themselves to build, download, share, and load in abilities into the game?
That is a question for JB. In terms of the data, you should be able to do that. You won't necessarily be able to use those abilities if you don't have the components unlocked. And they won't necessarily have the same stats that you would see someone else have, because if the stats are calculated based on your weapon or whatever, you won't see the right stats. Or if or if you don't have the right proficiency, your advancement in that component basically might not give you the same bonuses as somebody else has. But just the combinations and stuff, I think you probably should be able to do data-wise. It would just be a question of like if the API and the UI or website supports that.
Fantaram asks, are there any classes with a significant amount of mobility taken from abilities rather than regular holding down WASD movement?
Not especially. We sort of have tried to stay away from a lot of the teleportation and stuff like that. There's nothing that really does like flight and things.
There's some interesting things with like the Wisp, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to think through what everybody actually does. Like I said, there's 30 of these guys, and I don't necessarily look at them all the time because we're not working on a lot of them actively, and they're not even in the game, so I haven't necessarily gone through them all that recently to know right offhand what everybody has. The Wisp certainly does, because he basically turns into this little ball of glowy light and can do all kinds of crazy things while he's in that form. I think the Dullahan probably has some, but it's not like a core mechanic where it's like one of these classes flies and nobody else can fly, right? So mostly movement based things are either like just movement enhancing, where it's like the charge ability of fighters just makes them run faster. It doesn't make them teleport. It doesn't make them like dash, where they effectively teleport with an animation over a duration, right? It's just ways to adjust your movement speed and make you immune to movement impairing effects and things like that. And that allows you to read a lot better and tell what's going on when there's so many people, because if everybody's zipping around everywhere in a really large battle, it's going to be a bit more chaotic. So we've tried to curtail that a little bit. But there are a few of those things. I think especially when you get into like stealth characters, because they're sort of popping in and out of like corporeal existence. Yeah, you might get a little bit of that, but that's kind of their thing. So that might be one of the closest things that you see in sort of that way. And there are other classes that we've talked about having like illusions and stuff, but not too many things that actually will like relocate from one place to another instantaneously.
Okay. Well, I feel like you guys might both have an answer to this question. 5-minute warning, folks. So this might be a nice question to end with. Let's see. John asks, between graphical content, monsters, zones, etc., and underlying systems, engine work, balancing, etc., which is likely to take more time between now and release, and by how much?
Those are examples that don't fall into those categories.
One of the things about the way we have approached development in this project is we're very just pragmatic about where we have resources and where those resources can be allocated. When you start getting into, say, asset and content creation, there's options for, say, outsourcing some of that, and we've evaluated the potential for some of that. And outsourcing isn't always as simple a solution as it sounds like. You have to manage all the assets coming back, and you have to manage your outsourcing, and you have to do quality control on it, and then you have to get it imported, and hopefully it matches up with all your expectations and all your requirements. And so there are, again, just resources there that we can deploy. Sometimes we can turn engineering hours into productivity on the design or art side of things by investing in our tools. And sometimes we can say, it's okay if this thing takes a little bit longer so that we can insert other feature into the game. And so a lot of times it's not as simple to say, which is going to be more difficult, or which is going to be the long pull, art or asset or design or engineering, because sometimes those resources are interchangeable, and sometimes there are other solutions if you think outside the box a little bit. And
So in terms of that balance between like content and tech, I would say that our studio is, I don't know what even the ratio is, like between content, art, and design. It's way more on the tech side, right? So we have way more programmers than we have artists and designers. So that's sort of where our development goes, is into tech. And a lot of that is because we're building an engine. almost entirely in-house, almost entirely from scratch.
Which is why we look to solutions like procedurally generated terrain.
Yeah, well,
programmatic solutions to art problems.
Yeah, well, we certainly do that because of that ratio, right? We could certainly, like, nothing about building our own engine means that we couldn't go out and hire twice as many artists. We could, but we're also not a big budget game.
Yeah.
So I would say that's more why, is that we just don't allocate our resources that way. And so a lot more time and effort has gone into tech on this project than has gone into anything else. Which is why you see the game sort of, if you go into our tests and if you're part of the beta right now, that's sort of what you'll see, right? Is that the art doesn't look great in a lot of cases. We don't have a lot of zones. There's not a lot of content. There's not a lot of classes in the game yet. But there is a fully functional engine that can scale up to more players than any other game that I'm aware of. So that's sort of where the development effort has gone, at least thus far. And will continue to go, likely, because like Tim was saying, since our team is not structured to have a lot of artists, we're looking at technical solutions to artistic and sometimes design problems. So if we have a procedural algorithm, let's say, that can fill the world with trees, well, then that's what we'll use to put trees everywhere, rather than hiring, a bunch of artists to go and hand place all of the trees. So that's sort of where that's going, where there are a lot of things on the tech side and not a lot of things going on the art side, so that we can maintain our ratio and continue developing the game as a very advanced technical platform as well.
Yeah, having talked with Andrew, who worked on other bigger projects, and in some games there was, and in other studios he's worked at, there was a woman whose job was to place like every bush in the world, right?
Yeah.
And you could afford to have one person doing nothing but bushes, and one person doing nothing but rocks, and one person doing nothing but trees, and we are neither that size studio nor, as Ben suggested, that distribution of studio. We just don't have that many artists because A, we're engineer heavy, and B, we don't have that many people, and so sometimes our solutions are a little bit different than a big name studio with a big budget.
All right, this is too funny to not ask. Lodoween asks, what design cheat is the most impressive that Tim has come up with? I guess impressive to Ben, maybe. Which cheat are you, Tim, most happy to have found?
Oh, just cheating around stuff? I don't know.
I don't know. Tim doesn't really cheat. Like, you can certainly cheat in a lot of programming ways.
Yeah.
That don't necessarily happen. Probably the best one has been like running around with no pants, because for a long time pants didn't matter.
Yeah, there were some fun ones with
wasn't it that like pants slowed you down?
Yep.
Oh yeah, they certainly slowed you down.
Yeah. Anybody who's run into Bumble for a while there, like armor wasn't contributing stats, and so Bumble would just run around stark-ass naked. But there were some fun ones with the stone healers where you could get inside like geometry. Generally, like, I find stuff like that, but I try not to exploit it because I don't want you guys to have a bad experience when we come into games. So there's not a whole lot of like shenanigans that happen in and around the cheats and exploits I find. We have lots of fun every time Donnie finds something new and interesting.
Yeah, we have a lot more players who will find and exploit things for us than we have developers who will. So that's always a good thing, because it allows us to try and fix those things, or just leave them in the game because they're funny.
Yeah, lately I've been doing lots of just trying to figure out different combinations of abilities, just playing the game and seeing what's OP or not in the game. And every time I think I find something OP, one of the backers just comes along and cream me. Like I'll slaughter through like a whole field of your team, and then that one guy will run up and trounce me even harder. So the joys of seeing the sauce made. It's been fun, and we love playing with you guys, and love having you guys out there finding some of this stuff for and with us.
Seems like a good note to end on.
Sure.
All right. Well, Keep an eye out for our email update with the top 10-ish.
We'll not be having a test this weekend.
Important info. No test this weekend. Anything else?
That's all I've got on my radar. We're getting really close to having the new Siege scenario ready for the prime time. So keep your eyes and ears open for those emails when they go out, but it probably won't be this weekend.
All right, and we'll see you later.
Cool. Thanks a bunch, guys.